It's good for us to be here, and I'm really excited to be here at St. Luke's. I want to thank Shelley. I want to thank the ministerial team here, and I want to thank these remarkable co-executive directors, servant leader interns, site coordinators, and more than anything else, these remarkable Freedom School scholars here. Let the children lead, let the children read, let the children march. They got this. I have the enviable position of being between you and lunch, following an esteemed elder and a statesman, that is, a politician who likes Dr. King, so he is a politician who listens and follows preachers. And so I want to be mindful of time. Is that all right? I was asked to talk about the impact of educational inequity in our communities and on young people. I hear the conversation about narratives and banned books, and I am inspired to chase the root causes of where we find ourselves. And so what I'd like to do, if you'll walk with me for a second, is I want to map a little bit how we got here. Or better named, Baba Asa Hilliard was already lifted up here and was already told us we all start with what's going on. We got to start with what's going on. And so I want to just put a little bit of a national spin on the conversation and some of the details that you got before, but then I want to get behind them for a second. Is that all right? So there's this thing you may not know about me from the bio. You heard Reverend, which tells you I'm a preacher, and I am rooted while I am denominationally ambiguous. I was raised in the National Baptist Church. I was ordained in the Progressive National Baptist Convention. I pastored the United Church of Christ congregation. I served as a congregation-based campus minister in the United Methodist congregation, and I'm now affiliated with the American Baptist Churches. I'm denominationally ambiguous. Some people say ecumenical. But I was nurtured in the bowels of the historic black church tradition where we have this thing called call and response. And so the preacher says a thing and people talk back to the preacher. I have found, because I've served in diverse settings, including pastoring an interracial congregation, that while people who have been twice kissed by God's Son have no problem interrupting the preacher, that my brothers and sisters who grew up in less hued spaces have been taught that it's rude to talk while somebody else is talking. So I'm coming first to give you permission to talk back to me. Is that all right? That was a test. Thank y'all very much. Thank y'all. Thank y'all very much. As we enter into this conversation, it is important for us to lift up some of the statistics. I'll do that, and then I'm going to put this down. I want to turn you to a report entitled Banned in the USA, The Mounting Pressure to Censor by PEN America, because it appropriately frames the American and national context for this particular form of censorship that we're talking about. In the 2022-2023 school year, from July 1 to 2022 to June 30th, 2023, PEN America recorded 3,362 instances of book bans in U.S. public schools, classrooms, and libraries. These bans removed student access to 1,557 unique book titles from 1,480 authors, illustrators, and translators. You may not be surprised to know that these authors, illustrators, and translators are more likely women, more likely LGBTQIA, more likely people of color. You won't be surprised because you followed the conversation about Indiana Bill 1447, or you heard the lesson that E.I. Payne gave us about this today. You're not surprised about that going on. It's important for us, though, to look beyond the statistics and the data in the reports to understand how we got here. So it's not just what's going on, it's also how we got here. Somebody say, how did we get here? We got here because in the context of the pandemic, you began to hear reference to this earlier, but I want to name it more explicitly. There was a movement that that started around school board meetings, places like Loudoun County, Virginia, where we began to hear people under the banner of parents' rights, say parents' rights. Groups of people, many of whom did not have children in the school districts, who were not parents themselves, people who identified with motherhood perhaps as an ethereal issue because they weren't mamas, who fought for liberty even though they seemed to be fighting against freedom, took a set of issues and began under the banner of parents' rights to advance a movement to take the authority of elected leaders and educators from them to drive the educational circumstances in schools. This parents' rights movement, typified by groups like Moms for Liberty that has been called by the Southern Poverty Law Center a hate group in America, began to say that you can't tell me what to teach my kids because my kids are my kids. You can't make me vaccinate my kids even though it makes other kids unsafe. And you can't tell me that I have to invest in the social emotional wellness of LGBTQIA students or other students who have been traumatized because I get to determine what's right for my kids because my kids are my private parental property. They didn't go that far. But that's what was behind it. A movement and orientation of parents' rights mitigates directly against the global commitments to children's rights. What they have done is taken the privatization of children. I'm talking about this in the church because this is churchy stuff. This is theological stuff. Children as property of the parent, rather than children as the hopes of the provisions for the community. Children, where are my church people? Where are my church people? Okay. Children as yours for you to do what you will with, versus the hope of progeny that is deep in the Judeo-Christian tradition, that the great blessing, blessed is he who has children. Children are a blessing from the Lord. Happy is the man whose quiver is full of them. That passage in Isaiah 11 where we talk about a peaceable kingdom and the peaceable kingdom and the promise of the kingdom where the lion and the lamb lay down together and a little child leading them, where a young child does remarkable things that other people think can't be done, and that child is the center of it. This is deeply rooted in these traditions that are taught in the lives of our churches, synagogues, and mosques. But what they have said is something that, frankly, we have said as a nation, is that children are the private property of the parent. And this gives the capacity to have a conversation where parents have grounding to say, you can't make my children read that book. Y'all still with me? Stay with me, I'm going somewhere. I say that we have done this as a nation because when I was in middle school, long time ago, scholars, not so long for some of y'all laughing at me. When I was in middle school and the nation was engaged in the conversation with the United Nations and global folks across the country about a UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, we affirmed those two out of three prongs of the global children's rights movement: provision, protection, and participation. Provision. Young people ought to have all the things that they need to thrive and grow as adults, into productive adults. They also, of course, ought to have the things that they need to enjoy childhood as a stage of development in and of itself. You know, children are more than little staging adults. And then, of course, protection. That there are things that should not happen to children, and we have a responsibility to keep from happening to them. But the third leg of that three-legged stool of global children's rights is participation. Is that young people deserve to have voice in the things that impact them. And we, the United States of America, in the context of the UN, did work to undermine the affirmation of young people's participation and voice at the United Nations more than 30 years ago. And by virtue of that, we began to assert ourselves as the authorities over children individually rather than collectively, and we've left ourselves open for this fight. I said we're going to talk about how we got here, right? And so I lay all of this out because I want to lay out what I think is not only the impact of this conversation, Because we have left ground for people to say that educators can't determine what needs to be in the educational system. We've left ground to say that those who are elected to make decisions about what books belong in schools and libraries can't make it. We're going to take that back for ourselves, even if we have not been best educated to do so. That's how we got here. That's what. That's just what. We can't stop at what. We got to go to so what. So what? What are the implications Shelley asked me to talk to you about? Well, these are the implications, and there are costs. I will try not to get too political, but I want to talk about the impact on children and young people. Is that okay? And I want to talk about children and young people as the core hope of a community, not just because I am a person of faith and I believe that the promise of progeny is critical to what I see in the Judeo-Christian scriptures, but I say that also because I believe that the project of America is rooted always on the next generation. And I believe that they are more than just the project and promise for us, that we have a responsibility to them. And so I want to talk about the impact on children. Is that all right? That's still all right? You sure it's all right? Just remember you told me it was okay. First, I want to talk about and share that there's an impact first on young people's identity. Let the group say identity. At the same time that we're having discussions about whether young people get to see themselves in books, get to see stories of their heritage and their traditions, get to see an affirmation of what they can do, that they can make a difference in themselves and in their families, in their communities, in their country, and in the world. At the same time that we are stripping these stories away, young people are dealing with the deepest behavioral health crisis that we have seen among children and youth in our lifetimes, even before the pandemic, which took young people from the regularity and the routine of their schools and their friends, causing the disequilibrium that raises questions about who they are, taking them from a space of socialization at critical ages, like my son, who is taken out of his school in middle schools for 2 years away from his young people who are his friends in the middle of a critical time for his self-identity. He also identifies with those people that the Congressional Black Caucus talked about in December of 2019, pre-pandemic. Young black boys who are the fastest growing group of Americans committing or dying by suicide. Rising suicide rates are exacerbated not just by, especially for black and brown children, who, by the way, are, as of 2020, the majority of America's 74 million children. Rising suicide rates among them are driven not just by the disequilibrium of a pandemic, but by the preconditions of structural racism and stressors that are created upon them that they see in their communities and they see their families wrestling with. Also, of course, by exposure to social media that has them have access to information that they are not readily prepared to process. We have already seen the research and the impacts that is amplified by the U.S. Surgeon General about the impact of social media, especially on young girls, and demeaning their self-identity. And then we take away the books where they can see themselves and see their stories, the books that they connect with that help them to read, the settings where they can be affirmed, not by sitting down and being quiet and standing in line and raising their hand, but standing and deliver, shouting and dancing, because they have a word to say for the world, because we understand that their cries. I'm sorry, I'm trying not to preach. It's a chapel though, you know? I keep hearing this 17-year-old boy named Jeremiah, who said he was called to share a word with the nation, and he said, "I'm just a boy." Biblical scholars, Dr. Williams, said that Jeremiah was about 17 years old. What if we understood the cries of the children to be the voice of God? What if we understood the shaping of their identity to be critical to our call to mission? The implications of taking away books where they see themselves and their narratives, the implications of not making sure they have everything they need in their education is that we impact negatively their identity at a time when they need the most significant affirmation. But it's not just identity. it's also their inclusion. And it's their inclusion in the American project. I'm careful with this language here. I'll find my way, Kendrick, to be able to explain what I'm talking about. But inclusion in the American project has to do with two things. Number one, this idea. So I'm a Gen Xer. Any other Gen Xers in the room? Yeah. Stand in solidarity with your boy. We're this transitional generation everybody forgets, between the boomers and the millennials, and now you got Gen Z, but we try to hold it down. We try to keep people connected, right? And we were taught this thing. Perhaps we were taught this thing, I was taught this thing, that if you do these three things in America, this is what you do. If you get an education, you defer gratification, and you work hard, you can do better than your parents. Anybody else taught that? All right. So this is the thing. This thing by Gen X, I try to make it so that we're special, because people don't believe we're special. They think we're just a bridge. In the 1950s, 90% of American citizens, according to Opportunity Insights research from Raj Chetty and his scholars at Harvard University on economic mobility, in 1950, 90% of Americans actually did better than their parents in 1950. For those entering the workforce in 2020, not Gen X, but millennials, only 40% of them will do better than their parents. We were told if you defer gratification, get an education, and work hard, you can do better than your parents financially. Economic mobility. What is economic mobility? It is this idea that you can do better than your parents financially. You can go up a rung on that ladder of economic stability in America. You know what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that is millennials are the most educated generation in American history. Education has fallen by the way of the structures of the economy such that it's not allowing for people to do better than their parents. And so that decline is a critical part of the promise of what we have once called the American dream. Social mobility, the capacity to do better than your parents, and young people. Now, I'm not saying, when I say that, I forgot my Gen X people. I forgot why this makes us special. We're the last ones. We're the last ones who can say with truth and data that our education got us out. We're the last ones. And it doesn't save us from all the other things. A black woman with a graduate degree is still more likely to die as it relates to complications of maternal health than a white woman with a high school diploma. It doesn't save us from all the other stuff. My solidly middle-class black boys, I have 3 of them, my solidly middle-class black boys who have the greatest indicator of well-being that any child can have. Do you know the greatest indicator of well-being for any child? The level of education of the mother. My wife's a dentist. She's a doctor. I married well. And yet, black boys who are middle class are more likely to end up poor than they are to remain the middle class. The education is important, but it is not a panacea. And I name that because their inclusion requires education to be staged and prepared for American inclusion, but it also requires something of us. Inclusion in the economy is one thing, but there's also inclusion in the democratic project. The state senator talked about the crisis of democracy. I want to talk about the crisis for young people based upon the fact that public education, y'all stay with me here, public education is experiencing a crisis of mission that we have allowed. We have turned public education, K-12 education, into a workforce development program that is driven by the needs and wants of economic and corporate leaders who position themselves as civic leaders in order to drive what the school district is supposed to do. I don't know that because I've been reading the newspapers in Indianapolis. I know that because I have lived it in 3 different communities across the United States of America, and I know that the playbook here is the playbook there. What do I mean? What I mean is, public education in America's first core mission was the preparation of an educated citizenry to engage the franchise. It's about making sure we have what we need to be good citizens first, not good workers to earn for others, especially in a system where we can aggregate wealth as we have in the last few generations. We can take away the capacity for labor to speak with one voice. And by doing such, we can actually take away your ability to do better even if you get education. We brought you here to talk about reading. What does that have to do with anything? It has to do with this. When we're reading books only to prepare young people to be cogs in a machine, we're not enlivening the hopes, the dignity, the joy that they need to be curious, creative learners for life that they can take into any place. It is a crisis of mission that requires a commitment to equity so that every young person has exactly what they need. I'm gonna get to the good part in a minute. The stakes have to do with young people's identity. The stakes have to do with young people's inclusion, but more importantly, it has to do with their imaginations. They used to say a very simple thing when I was growing up: you can't be what you don't see. Taking away books that have young people serving and being heroes in their own story, seeing heroines of yesteryear who are also of their tradition, causes them not to be able to see what they can become. This is critical based upon the other thing. The state senator talked about this really important speech that Martin Luther King gave at Riverside Church, the Beyond Vietnam speech, a time to break silence, when he made his break and open message there to church people about the need to speak out against Vietnam. He spent a week after that dealing with remarkable incoming from his friends, people he had called friends, black leaders who had been brought in order to speak directly against him. And he found himself in a space of depression that, frankly, he had been wrestling with since before the age of 13. It is documented by historians that he wrestled with social emotional wellness challenges and perhaps even depression as early as 11 years old. And so he found himself in one of those dark places again, but he had to give a speech 7 days later at Stanford University on the other side of the country, and he had incoming all week. And so the first thing he had to do at Stanford, when he stood up, he had to tell people before he gave this speech called The Other America. He had to tell them, hey, I'm not talking about Vietnam today. Just to let people roll their shoulders down. But in some of the most powerful imagery of the message that he gave there at Stanford, where he talked about one America and the other America, he used the imagery of children. He talked about one America where children, largely white children, live with the sunlight of opportunity shining on their faces. But in the other America, he talked about young people who had the clouds of inferiority on the skies of their minds. One of the impacts of taking away the creative capacity for young people on one side of Indiana to see the stories of joy and experience of their forebearers who have experienced remarkable joy in places like Illinois or Itabena, Mississippi, a generation before, is that it keeps the fogginess before them of the clouds of inferiority on the skies of their mind. And if we care about affirming young people's identity, and if we care about assuring their inclusion in the American project, and if we care about unleashing the power of their imagination, then we've got to do something. And so I want to share what I think we need to do, and then I'll be done. And hopefully get you to the smoking pastor just in time for you to have some good lunch. First and foremost, I believe because we got here with a critical movement around parents' rights, we have to renew and build with popular education a movement for children's rights. Here I commend you to the work, because I only got about 5 more minutes. I commend you to check out the work of a scholar by the name of Adam Benferrado. Adam Benferrado is at Drexel University, and there, in his most recent book that was released February of last year, he talks about a minor revolution. Advancing children's rights at appropriate stages and ages of development as a means to advance all of American society. So he talks about things like young people's right to attachment, which might drive a commitment to family medical leave practices that allows mom to be there for longer when a child is born. And he talks about the right to a clean slate. That may drive a conversation about whether young people should carry indebtedness for education that we told them they had to get ahead into the next generation, or whether we should wipe that debt out so they can actually advance economically. A movement for children's rights would affirm and listen deeply to children in all of our settings and hear appropriately from them what they want for their well-being. Can I point out an educational inequity that we don't talk about a lot? Can I do that? It's slightly off, but I think it'll point you to a direction of what true equity looks like in education. Is that okay? One of the things that Adam talks about is the right to voice, and he affirms a movement to lower the voting age in America. Oh, y'all know we were going to talk about that, huh? He points to places. He points to what it means, a commitment, remember, to voice. And I use this example because in my neighborhood outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland, in my house, I live, y'all pray for me. I invite y'all to pray for me. I grew up as a city kid in Dallas, and then I lived in the city in New Orleans, and I lived in the city in St. Louis, and now in D.C., I'm of a certain age, and I live in the suburbs. I am a suburban father. I even live on a cul-de-sac. I live on a cul-de-sac. It makes my heart beat like fast when I think about the fact I now live on a cul-de-sac. But on my cul-de-sac, next door to me, a remarkable AAPI family, and there are two parents there together, two children in the household, and Stephen, the father, my neighbor, Stephen grew up in the schools in our neighborhood and then decided to come back after he had gone away to school, buy a home in the neighborhood, raise his same kids in the neighborhood. It's great. He has two remarkable young boys that are not yet school age, but they have great fun in the middle of the circle in the cul-de-sac. I love watching them play. And then in our house, there's me and my wife, and we have 4 children. Yes, 4 children, pray for us. And our children range from 9 to 19. But last year, when my 19-year-old was still in the house, we were having a conversation about equity in education in our community. Because I learned when I was reading Adam's book, I learned that across the way in Tacoma Park, Maryland, for the last 10 years, 16-year-olds have been voting in municipal elections. 16-year-olds for a decade. This isn't a new progressive idea. A decade they've been voting in municipal elections. And we talked about the equity of the fact that there were 2 votes for the school board in our house where there were 4 children of school age. And there were 2 votes for the school board in my neighbor's house where there were no children of school age. Now, I can affirm and come along with the fact that the school district and its production has everything to do with the gifts for the entire community. But I'm wondering why the people next door have more voice in the school district. And I had a 16 and an 18-year-old who were in the school district who I believe, I'm just going to say this, I believe my 16-year-old can make better informed political decisions than some people that have the vote right now. And some people who are running to get votes right now. Why couldn't they have the vote? In Newark, New Jersey, earlier this year, it was the largest expansion of youth vote in American history when all young people in Newark got the right to vote in school board elections. A movement for child well-being would call for, a movement for children's rights would call for a consideration of the equitable oversight of our schools, including consideration of the fact that these largely black and brown young people who are 16, 17, and 18-year-olds across the country who have voice in these systems, who know how to map these systems. You saw these reports from these Freedom School scholars that told you when to go to school board meetings and what the superintendent ought to be doing for you and how you ought to be engaged with your school teacher and what that school principal owes you and how they ought to be responsive to you. If they can map it like this on this stage, why can't they vote for it at the ballot box? If we're going to respond to these impacts, equitable education, to respond to these cultural narratives, to affirm our young people requires us to engage in the kind of popular education and organizing for a movement for children's rights. It also calls for us to preach, teach, and cast a vision of child well-being. Everybody say well-being. Well-being, I'm gonna lean on another scholar. I'm taking you to my friend Ramesh Raghavan, who's at the Silver School of Social Work in New York. Ramesh says that child well-being has to do with 4 critical conditions. Number 1 is that children are able to develop as those their age and stage should. Number 2, that they are progressing toward becoming productive adults. Number 3, that they're able to enjoy childhood as a stage of development in and of itself. And number 4, that it's the responsibility of the community to create the conditions for children to thrive. An aspiration for child well-being is more than stopping bad things from happening to children. It's more than fighting against book bans. It's more than fighting against House Bill 1447. It is creating inclusive spaces where young people actually get to be affirmed. It is an alternative witness to this broken and busting and often disgusted situation that we find ourselves in. It is the responsibility to create Sabbath schools which predated freedom schools. It is the responsibility for us to take the resources that are in our communities and create the spaces for young people to be affirmed, even if the system does not do it, and to understand that that is only a demonstration project. Freedom schools were not meant to operate for 30 years in a community. They were meant to operate long enough for the systems to understand that they need to transform to look like what the freedom schools look like, so E.I. Payne and Dr. Payne can advance in the school system that IPS should look like a freedom school. And not to let the church folk off the hook, I feel our founder and president emeritus, Marian Wright Edelman, whispering in my ear from Washington, D.C., as she often says, every Sunday school ought to be a freedom school. The prophetic witness is to create, Walter Brueggemann says, the prophetic witness is to create an alternative to the system that we believe needs to be dismantled. So to create an affirmed child well-being is to create these spaces for ourselves and then show the system how it should integrate these elements while sending leaders forth into it. Dr. Brianna. The last thing I want to say, and I didn't know I was going to say all of this, and I think y'all got barbecue waiting on you, is that we have to own, this is on our own education, it's not the young people's education. We have to own in this conversation, especially in an election year, that the conversations we're having about the reclamation of democracy, about the critical nature of democracy and whether it's going to fall off a cliff in November, are outmoded and inaccurate. Because if we pay attention to our history, then we know that the project of inclusive multiracial democracy has never been in America. It is already in the concept of America that we hold in our hearts, but it is not yet in the America in which we live. Democracy in this context cannot be reclaimed, it must be raised for the first time. It must be raised in the lifetimes of this most diverse generation in American history. It must be raised by a commitment to these children who for the first time provide the demography for the democracy that we talk about to actually be. But if it's going to be raised, it's got to be rooted. It's got to be rooted in a new and true narrative of who we are as America, who we have been and who our children are. Who we are, warts and all, who we've been with the worst of our situations so we don't actually repeat them, and who we've been so we can lift up the stories like that when we celebrate this summer. 60 years ago in Mississippi, the Black freedom struggle produces the Mississippi Freedom Summer, where we for the first time see by the voice of a young college student by the name of Charles Cobb from Howard University, the expression and the building of freedom schools. And we use that, not just for the literacy development of young people, but for the civic engagement and leadership development of all of their parents. It's got to be rooted, it's got to be raised, and it's got to be re-envisioned. Re-envisioned by and in conversation with these children, for whom we should defer all moral authority. I know I shouldn't say heavy stuff at the end, the moral authority to define the future redounds to those who will live in it the longest. So who America will be, who the school district will be, should be first informed by creative listening to young people and who they need it to be. And then it must be advanced by the child advocates, by the educational equity folks who are committed to educational equity, by the faith leaders who understand the moral application that are in this very room. If we will respond effectively to what's going on, then we will need you to advance a movement for children's rights toward a vision of child well-being and raise democracy the first time by rooting it and re-envisioning it in partnership with all our children.